That first minute, before the shouting, before the orders, before the frantic realization, there is only one collective sensation: something has gone terribly, impossibly wrong. People feel it in their bones, in the sudden weight of the air, in the tremor of the floorboards. Mothers grip their children. Sailors glance toward one another with dread they dare not speak aloud. Captain Luce steadies himself, heart pounding, knowing that whatever struck them has already written the beginning of a tragedy he may not have the power to undo. The Atlantic holds its breath. The Arctic begins to die. If you're drawn to forgotten tragedies and the fragile human moments within them, consider joining us as we uncover stories the ocean tried to bury. Your presence helps keep these memories alive in the darkness they left behind. The Arctic trembled as if the ocean had reached up and seized her spine. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. No one spoke. The world simply hung. Suspended between what had been moments ago, warmth, chatter, the hum of engines, and what had now burst upon them with the violence of fate. Then sound returned all at once, boots clattering on wood, startled cries, the frantic slam of doors thrown open as passengers spilled into the corridors. A thin haze of steam rose from the engine room vents, curling into the cold air like injured breath. The ship listed a few degrees to port, barely enough to be noticed by a child, but enough to make every sailor on deck freeze. They knew the subtle language of a wounded vessel. A tilt like that meant something deep, something serious, something that would not be easily repaired. Captain Luce steadied himself against the wheelhouse frame as another vibration rippled through the hull. It was quieter this time, almost a groan, like an old structure settling under unbearable weight. Fog crept around the windows, smearing the lamplight into pale streaks. The captain's throat tightened as he reached for the speaking tube to engineering. "What's your condition?" he demanded. For a moment, only static and the distant cough of machinery answered. Then a strained voice broke through, trembling, "We're taking water, fast. She's flooding forward. Pumps can't keep up." Luce closed his eyes briefly. Not long, just long enough to accept that everything had changed. Below, the corridors bent in odd angles as the ship's gentle incline grew steadier. A man in a wool coat pressed a hand to the wall, feeling it tremble against his palm. A steward hurried past him, breathless, whispering to himself as though the motion might convince his mind that none of this was real. A young woman clutched her shawl tightly, pulling her son close. She could feel the boy's small heart pounding through his nightshirt, his eyes wide, searching her face for reassurance she didn't know how to give. The first rush of cold water tore into the lower deck with a violence that stole breath. It surged around boots and ankles, pooling, rising, dark as ink. A deckhand stumbled back, gasping at the shock of it. The smell of iron, oil, and broken wood filled the confined space, thick enough to taste. Men shouted for lanterns. Someone slipped. Someone screamed. Up on the main deck, the fog felt sharper now, as if the night itself had turned predatory. Lantern flames shivered in their glass cages. The ship, once proud and roaring with life, now emitted a low, continuous moan, metal protesting the sea's invasion. A cabin boy of maybe 14 hurried toward the bridge, feet slapping wet boards, eyes shimmering with terror he tried desperately to hide. His voice cracked as he delivered the message, "Sir, the bulkheads, one's already failing." Luce looked into the boy's eyes and saw the truth neither wanted to speak. The Atlantic was swallowing them. Inch by inch. Minute by minute. He stepped out onto the exposed walkway, cold wind cutting across his face. The fog parted just enough to reveal the shadow of another vessel drifting in the dark. The Vesta. They had struck her amidships, tearing steel open like fabric. The Arctic had dealt the blow, and yet, somehow, she was the one fatally wounded. Luce's jaw clenched. Fate was cruel like that. He gripped the rail. The metal was slick with freezing mist. Beneath him, he could hear the roar of water, the frantic shouts of men trying to hold back the unstoppable. He imagined the ocean rushing through corridors once filled with laughter, devouring suitcases, boots, letters tucked into pockets, toys left on floors. The sea cared nothing for memory. Passengers gathered on deck, shivering, eyes darting between officers and the choking fog. Some still clung to disbelief, their questions tumbling over one another. What happened? Are we safe? Is it under control? Others, sensing the truth instinctively, stared into the dark horizon with an expression that bordered on silent pleading. Luce forced himself to speak with calm authority, an anchor for the terrified faces around him. But inside, his thoughts churned like the sea beneath them. He knew the Arctic was grievously injured. Knew the water was pouring in faster than they could hope to expel. Knew the night was vast, cold, and merciless. The wind shifted, carrying the muffled sob of a child. A mother held her daughter tightly, whispering promises she hoped the ocean would allow her to keep. The Arctic shuddered again. And Captain Luce felt it, deep and hollow, like the vessel herself was drawing a painful breath. The catastrophe had only begun. The Arctic's bow dipped again, just a fraction, barely enough for the casual eye to notice, but enough for every seasoned sailor to feel as a quiet dagger sliding between ribs. The ship was wounded in a way that had no remedy. She felt heavier, slower, her movements tormented by the weight of the sea pouring into her lungs. Every creak of timber sounded like a plea for salvation. Below deck, water surged with increasing fury, slapping against the walls, swirling around crates, dragging clothing and personal belongings into its dark pool. A lantern toppled, smashing into the flood and sputtering out with a hiss that echoed down the corridor. Men worked in knee-deep water now, their boots sloshing, their shouts bouncing off the metal bulkheads in panicked fragments. One sailor, soaked to the bone, tried to brace a failing door, but the incoming water rammed into it with such force that it threw him backward, knocking the breath out of his lungs. He lay there, stunned, realizing it wasn't a door anymore, it was a dam waiting to burst. On the deck above, passengers pressed together, their breaths visible in the cold air. A violinist who had performed earlier that evening still wore his concert jacket, now damp with mist, his bow hand trembling not from the weather but from dread. He clutched his instrument case, a foolish, desperate gesture toward normalcy in a night that had abandoned it. Nearby, a man repeated his wife's name over and over, as if speaking it might summon her from the confusion below. Captain Luce moved among them with a kind of grave steadiness, though inside he felt the splintering pressure of choices that had no right answers. He paused at the rail again, staring down at the black water rushing past. The fog seemed to thicken, curling up the sides of the ship, crawling over the decks like a living thing. It felt as if the night were closing its fingers around the Arctic. He called for the officers to assemble. Their faces were pale, drawn, damp with sweat despite the cold. Some avoided his eyes, knowing the questions he would ask had only grim replies. How long? Luce murmured to the chief engineer, though the answer had already begun to form like ice inside his chest. The engineer swallowed hard. She won't hold, sir. Bulkheads aren't holding. Flooding spreading faster than we can track. His voice cracked. He steadied it. It's bad. A silence fell over the group, not heavy with shock but with the weight of dawning understanding. The Arctic, pride of the Collins line, darling of the Atlantic route, was dying in the water. A sudden wail rose from the starboard side, a mother realizing her child wasn't beside her. She pushed through the crowd, eyes frantic, hair clinging to her cheeks. Emma! Emma! Her voice sliced through the cold air. Sailors moved instinctively to help, but the desperation in her cry struck deeper than any command. Moments later, a young girl emerged with a steward, shivering, clutching his hand. The mother gathered her child into her arms with such desperation it seemed she feared the sea would rip her away at any second. Above them, the ship's funnel belched a strange sputter of steam, a struggling exhale from engines drowning in their own chambers. The lights flickered, dimmed, steadied, then dimmed again. A ripple of unease passed through the passengers, shoulders tightening, breaths catching. The Arctic's heartbeat was failing. In the wheelhouse, Luce leaned over the chart table, palms pressed flat against the map. The fog made navigation nearly impossible, stars and moon were nothing more than memories at this point. But steering toward land wasn't the question anymore, it was whether they had enough time left to give anyone a chance at survival. A young officer approached, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, the men say she feels lower in the water." Luce nodded once, slowly. He didn't trust his voice yet. A deep rumble vibrated through the hull, followed by a sickening lurch that tilted the deck several degrees. People grabbed for rails, for each other, for anything stable in a world that had just shifted beneath them. A lantern swung violently, casting wild shadows that danced across wet planks and frightened faces. Below, another bulkhead failed with a sound like thunder muffled underwater. The ocean surged forward. And the Arctic groaned, long, drawn out, mournful, like a living creature begging mercy from the inevitable. Captain Luce pushed away from the table, breathing hard, the weight of the night bearing down on him. The next phase of the tragedy was coming, fast as the freezing water racing through the ship's veins. The storm did not need thunder to announce itself, the growing wind was enough. It scraped along the Arctic's wounded hull, carrying with it the cold breath of the deep. Every few moments the ship gave a slow, uneven roll, as though struggling to remember how to stay afloat. The tilt had grown worse, just a few degrees more, but enough to make the deck feel foreign beneath the passengers' feet, as if the world had shifted into a cruel, slanted version of itself. Captain Luce made his way toward the bow, boots splashing through the wash of seawater creeping over the planks. He felt the ship sag beneath him, a lethargic heaviness that no vessel should ever possess. Ships were meant to ride the waves, but the Arctic seemed to cling to them now, sinking deeper with every breath. The fog curled around her railings, ghostly and deliberate, as if the night were claiming her piece by piece. At the forward stairwell, a group of sailors emerged drenched to the waist, their faces ashen. One of them, a broad-shouldered man who had worked aboard steamers his entire life, shook uncontrollably. "She's filling too fast," he rasped. "It's not a leak anymore, it's a flood." Luce nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Behind him, the deck groaned, long and low, like an exhausted creature dragging itself toward its final rest. A sudden cry rose from midship, sharp, panicked. Two officers were struggling to clear a jam on one of the davits. A lifeboat hung awkwardly, twisted, its ropes snarled. Passengers crowded around it, trembling with hope and fear. A man pushed forward, hands outstretched. "Please, my wife, my son, just get them in the boat." His voice cracked on the last word, collapsing under the weight of everything he could not control. The officers fought with the ropes, fingers stiff from cold, the wet fibers burning their skin. The lifeboat swayed dangerously, banging against the hull with a hollow, splintering thud. A woman flinched at the sound, clutching her daughter so tightly the child whimpered into her coat. Someone in the crowd began to sob quietly. Then a shudder, deep, resonant, raced through the ship's frame. Everything paused. Even the wind seemed to draw in a breath. The deck dipped beneath their feet, just a few inches, but enough to send ripples of terror through the gathered crowd. Water sloshed across the boards. A lantern went out with a hiss. Inside the ship, the ocean surged forward, smashing through a failing bulkhead with a roar that silenced every living sound. A torrent of frigid water exploded into the compartment, sweeping men off their feet, swallowing crates and barrels as though they were nothing more than driftwood. A fireman clung to a ladder, gasping, as the flood dragged at his legs with inhuman force. His candle lamp clattered into the rising water, its small flame vanishing forever. Above, the passengers felt the ship sag again. A child cried out. Someone whispered, "Dear God," another voice added, trembling, "She's going down." Luce felt the words like a blow. Not because they were wrong, but because they were finally, terribly true. He forced himself into motion, barking orders that barely rose above the wind. Lines were secured, knots pulled tight, officers dispatched to bring more passengers to the deck. Every second mattered, but time was slipping through their grasp like water through fingers. A man stumbled toward Luce, chest heaving, eyes wild. "Captain, Captain, we saw water coming through the floor near the salon, actual water." Luce gripped the man's shoulder, steadying him. "Keep to the deck. Stay with your family." But the man's voice broke. "My family is below, I can't reach them, the stairs are flooded." His words melted into a ragged sob. Luce felt his throat tighten, a pulse of helplessness pounding behind his ribs. For an instant, the world narrowed to the man in front of him, the raw, unfiltered grief in his eyes. Luce opened his mouth to speak, but another violent shudder cut him off. The Arctic gasped again, her bow dipping noticeably. A swell of seawater rushed across the forward deck, swamping boots, overturning a wooden crate and sweeping it away like a toy. Passengers screamed. Officers shouted. The fog moved in closer, thicker, swallowing shapes and turning voices into echoes. Captain Luce stared out over the churning black expanse, his fists clenched so tightly the bones ached. The night had taken the ship's strength, taken her balance, taken her hope. And now it was reaching for her life. The collision had shattered more than steel. It had shattered certainty, order, faith, everything that had held the Arctic together. Now, as the sea climbed higher and the deck tilted underfoot, the truth settled cold and merciless over all of them. The ship would not survive the night. And not everyone aboard would see the dawn that refused to come. The sea had begun its slow, merciless climb over the Arctic's wounded body. Water pooled along the slanted deck, icy and black, reflecting fractured lantern light in trembling shards. Every few moments the ship groaned, a deep, mournful sound that traveled through the souls of everyone standing aboard her. It felt like standing on the chest of a dying giant, feeling each faltering breath as the end drew closer. Captain Luce tightened his grip on the rail as another wave slammed against the hull, sending cold spray into his face. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. Men watched him, searching his expression for hope or fear, for anything that might anchor them as the night unraveled around them. But Luce's face was carved in a rigid mask of control, though inside him something fragile was beginning to splinter. "Get the boats ready," he told his officers. "All of them." The words tasted like defeat. On the port side, passengers pressed together, shivering under the bitter wind. Mothers wrapped their arms around their children, whispering encouragement with trembling voices. A boy no older than 7 clutched a tin toy ship, blue paint chipped at the bow, as if refusing to let go of a world where ships stayed afloat and nights ended in warmth. "Is it sinking?" he asked. His mother hesitated, just long enough for the truth to pass through her eyes. "We're going to be all right," she murmured. "Just hold my hand." But the boy felt her shaking. He tightened his grip, his small fingers cold and stiff. Nearby, 2 sailors struggled with the first lifeboat. Frostbitten ropes resisted their hands, stiff and hostile. Every pull burned their palms. A knot jammed, refusing to budge. The officers shouted, voices cracking with urgency. "Hurry, she's tipping further." A sudden roll of the hull threw everyone off balance. The ship leaned sharply, sending passengers stumbling into each other as the deck became a sliding plane beneath their feet. A man lost his footing and crashed to the boards, gasping as icy water splashed over him. A woman screamed as a crate broke loose and slid toward the rail, narrowly missing her. The Arctic was unmaking herself. Inside the ship, the reality was even more brutal. Freezing water tore down the corridors, smashing through doors, extinguishing lanterns with violent hisses. Rooms filled in minutes. Mattresses floated. Chairs tumbled. A photograph drifted face up in the rising flood, a family captured in summer sunlight, before it vanished beneath a surge. A steward fought his way up the stairs, soaked to the chest, eyes wide and wild. "The water's at the cabins," he shouted. "The lower deck is gone." The word struck the passengers like a blow. A ripple of horror spread through them, gasps, cries, whispered prayers, and panic began to take a living form. People surged toward the rail, pushing, pleading, begging to be let near the boats. "Stand back," an officer shouted, but his voice cracked. "Women and children first." But fear does not respect order. A man grabbed at the lifeboat, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Please, please, I have a family." His desperation spilled out of him in shaking breaths. Another passenger shoved him aside, another tried to climb onto the davit. Chaos rippled outward, swift and merciless. Captain Luce stepped forward, slamming his hand onto the man's shoulder. "Get control of yourself." But the man sobbed, gripping the captain's coat. "We're all going to die, we're all." Luce wrested himself free. His voice, usually steady as steel, trembled at the edges. "Not if you listen. Let us work." But even as he said it, the ship cried out, a long, jagged shriek of bending metal. The deck dropped beneath them, then steadied, as though the Arctic were fighting a losing battle against gravity. A child screamed. The first lifeboat finally swung outward. Officers guided women and children into it as gently as shaking hands would allow. The boat creaked, dangling over the abyss. A lantern above flickered, painting pale gold on faces wet with spray and fear. Lower away. The ropes whined. The boat descended, bobbing violently as it neared the water. For a moment, hope flickered in the air. Then a wave surged upward, smashing against it, nearly capsizing it. Screams tore across the sea. The next wave lifted it, dropping it hard. It drifted away, a fragile cradle on an ocean with no mercy. Back on deck, passengers stared after it with hollow eyes, some whispering prayers, some unable to speak at all. The wind carried their fear out across the endless black horizon. Captain Luce looked into the fog. There were more boats to lower. More souls to save. And far too little time. The Arctic's remaining lifeboats hung like fragile promises above a hungry sea. Each one felt smaller than the last, each rope more brittle, each moment more precious. The ship was sinking faster now, no longer in slow, reluctant inches but in shuddering, uneven plunges that made the deck tremble underfoot. People could feel it, deep in their legs, like the earth itself had begun to give way. Another groan rose from the hull, long, guttural, full of suffering. It silenced conversation instantly. Even the wind seemed to falter, as though listening. On the starboard side, a second lifeboat was being loaded. Officers worked with frantic precision, but their hands shook, their breath clouding the air. A girl with blonde hair clutched the edge of the boat, her lips blue, her teeth chattering violently. A sailor knelt to her level. "You'll be safe soon," he whispered. The girl stared at him, her voice barely a tremble. "Will Mama come too?" The sailor hesitated, too long, and something in her face changed, as though the truth had seeped into her bones before the words could be spoken. Her mother, still somewhere in the crush behind them, did not reach the boat before the officer turned and shouted. "Lower away." The ropes groaned, the boat descended, the girl's whimper faded into the storm. Her mother's scream tore through the fog. On the opposite side, Captain Luce wrestled with the crowd pushing toward the next boat. The deck pitched again, sending people sliding on the wet boards. A man fell hard, the breath knocked out of him. Another passenger helped him up, gripping his arm tightly, fear binding strangers together in brief, fragile alliances. "Please," a woman cried, lifting a baby wrapped in wool. "My child, take him. Take him." She held the tiny bundle toward the nearest officer, tears streaming down her face. The baby's small fist peeked out, trembling. The officer's hands shook as he took the child and passed him to a sailor already in the boat. The mother choked back a sob when she realized she would not be allowed to board. She pressed her hand to her lips, whispering a final blessing, as the boat lowered with her child inside, separating them forever. Captain Luce saw the moment her knees buckled. A steward caught her just before she collapsed completely. Every loss tonight was a wound, and the ship, already broken, seemed to absorb the grief into her groans. A sharp, violent crack erupted beneath the deck. It felt like the ship's spine had snapped. People clung to rails as the Arctic canted sharply to port. Loose luggage slid across the planks. A lantern broke, spilling flame for an instant before the sea washed it out. The tilt remained, severe, unnatural, terrifying. Far below, the boilers touched seawater at last. A burst of steam roared upward through the vents, a scalding breath of death that hissed into the night. Men near the grate staggered back, coughing, wiping their eyes. "She's going," someone cried. "She's going right now." But still the lifeboats needed lowering. Still people clung to the chance of survival. A group of young men, passengers, not sailors, began lowering a boat themselves, refusing to wait. Their movements were frantic, their understanding lacking. One rope loosened too quickly, the boat dropped unevenly, and half the passengers inside spilled into the freezing water. Their cries were sharp, panicked, quickly muffled. A woman on deck covered her mouth, trembling violently. "No, no." A sailor dove in after them, fighting against the waves, but the cold clamped onto him like iron. He pushed one survivor toward a piece of floating wreckage, coughing, shaking, gasping. Captain Luce watched helplessly as the cold dragged him under. A moment later he resurfaced, flailing weakly, but another wave washed over him, and he vanished for good. The captain bowed his head. Each life lost carved deeper lines into his face. Still, he shouted over the storm, "Stand back. Let the boat come through." But panic was louder than his voice now. Terror had taken a solid shape, people moved with it, breathed with it, succumbed to it. There was no longer order, only desperation wrapped in human form. The third lifeboat swung out. A mother and two sons climbed in. A man tried to follow, officers shoved him back. He lunged again, screaming his children's names, but the boat was already lowering. He fell to the deck, sobbing, pounding the boards with his fists as his sons drifted into the fog. Luce turned away. The sight was too much. The ship lurched again, dramatically this time, and water flooded across the deck like a living creature. The Arctic was no longer sinking. She was dying. The Arctic's bow plunged lower still, swallowing more of the deck beneath the relentless black water. Each dip felt deeper, more final, a confession from the ship herself that she could no longer fight. Lanterns swung wildly above, their trembling light casting frantic shadows on faces pale with cold and terror. The wind had sharpened into a blade, slicing through coats, through resolve, through the last thin thread of hope. Captain Luce moved through the chaos with a deliberate steadiness that cost him everything. His boots splashed through rising water, each cold shock up his ankles reminded him that the sea was already on deck, creeping forward like an advancing line of death. People parted for him, some grabbing at his arm, some pleading, some simply staring with hollow disbelief. "Captain, please, my wife is below, she hasn't come up." He had no answers left that didn't taste of despair. Down by the fourth lifeboat, the officers struggled as the ship leaned even harder to port. The boat dangled at a sickening angle, its ropes grinding against metal fittings that groaned under the strain. Passengers pressed toward it, some sobbing, some eerily silent. One elderly man tried to climb in, but a wave swept across the deck at that moment, knocking him sideways. He fell hard, gasping as two younger men lifted him back to his feet. Near the rail, a teenage boy braced himself against the tilt, arms wrapped around his younger sister. She buried her face into his coat, shivering uncontrollably. He whispered to her, voice cracking, "It's all right. I'm here. I won't let go." But when the officer called for children to enter the boat, the boy froze. The girl was chosen. He was not. Their eyes locked, hers wide with terror, his filled with a pain too immense for someone so young. She reached for him as an officer lifted her away. "Please, no, no, don't take her without me," his cry cut through the night like a blade. The officer hesitated, but another shouted for speed. The boat was lowering. The girl's hand stretched toward her brother until fog swallowed her small silhouette. The boy collapsed against the rail, shoulders shaking. Captain Luce turned away, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. A violent tremor rippled through the ship, so strong that passengers toppled like dominoes. It felt as if the Arctic had struck something beneath the surface, though everyone knew the truth. Her insides were collapsing, one chamber after another filling with the crushing weight of the Atlantic. The deck dropped sharply, and the bow dipped under a surge of water. Screams erupted. Men scrambled back. Women lifted children in their arms. The sea poured across the deck with brutal force, sweeping hats, crates, even a loose coil of rope overboard. The next lifeboat was being readied, one of the last. Officers shouted conflicting orders. A sailor tied off a rope with shaking hands, but the knot slipped. The boat lurched sideways, nearly overturning. A man inside grabbed the edge, knuckles white. "Hold her steady," someone shouted. But steady was no longer possible. The Arctic shifted again, her stern rising as the bow sank further. People clung to anything bolted down, rails, vents, cargo hooks. Some slid across the slick planks, clawing at the wood, slipping toward the encroaching sea. A mother lost her grip on her toddler. The child slid screaming across the deck until a sailor dove, catching him just before the water could take him. The mother's cry broke every heart within earshot. She scooped the child into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Above, the funnel let out a dying cough, one last exhale of steam as the engines drowned for good. A low rumble vibrated through the ship. The noise was unmistakable, final failure. The lights flickered. Dimmed. Returned. Dimmed again. Darkness threatened to swallow them. Captain Luce steadied himself, gripping a rail. The cold cut through his bones, but the greater wound was inside him, a twisting agony of guilt and helplessness. He had commanded her across countless miles of ocean. He knew the Arctic like a living companion. And now he felt every moment of her suffering as if it were his own. A sailor approached him, breathless, eyes bloodshot. "Captain, there's nothing more we can do." Luce looked out across the sea where the faint outlines of distant lifeboats bobbed, fragile and small. Fog curled around them, hiding their shapes, hiding whatever fate awaited them. He nodded once, slow, broken. Another wave crashed across the deck, nearly toppling him. Passengers huddled together, clinging to family, to strangers, to anything that offered warmth or human connection. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly into the night, too numb to speak. The last workable lifeboat was almost ready. Officers shouted for final boarding. Chaos swelled again. But even as people surged toward the flicker of salvation, the ship answered with one long, harrowing groan, a sound that came from her very core. The Arctic was beginning her final descent. And everyone aboard could feel it. The sea had become a black, heaving graveyard of debris and distant cries. The fog no longer drifted, it clung, wrapping itself around the Arctic like burial cloth. What little remained of the night sky was hidden behind thick, unmoving clouds, turning the world into a single suffocating shade of darkness. There was no horizon. No sense of direction. Only the groaning bones of the dying ship and the endless, hungry water rising to claim her. The Arctic's bow was nearly submerged now, the deck angled into a steep descent that made every step a test of balance and survival. Passengers clung to the remaining railings, their bodies trembling, soaked to the skin, breath steaming in the cold. Some stared down into the water as though hypnotized by its impossible depth, others squeezed their eyes shut, refusing to witness the moment the ocean swallowed their last sanctuary. Captain Luce stood near the bridge, though the structure itself was nearly useless now, half drowned, fully powerless. His hands clutched the railing so tightly the chill bit into his skin, but he barely felt it. His gaze followed the last lifeboat fading into the fog, its lantern bobbing weakly, the faint cries aboard it swallowed almost instantly by the wind. A single thought gnawed at him: not enough. Not nearly enough. He had known from the start, long before the ship tilted so sharply, long before the last bulkhead surrendered, that there would never be enough boats, enough men, enough moments of grace to save everyone. The truth weighed on him like an anchor dragging through the hollow of his chest. Around him, the passengers who remained seemed suspended between sorrow and disbelief. A young woman knelt beside her unconscious husband, cradling his head against her lap. She rocked gently, humming through her tears, as though the motion alone might keep him tethered to this world. A man who had shouted and pushed only hours ago now stood silently with his back pressed against the funnel, whispering what sounded like apologies to no one in particular. The ship jerked again, a sharp, violent motion that jolted every soul aboard. A wave surged across the deck, knocking two people off their feet and nearly pulling one over the rail. A sailor lunged, grabbing the man by the collar, straining with all his strength to pull him back. For several seconds they struggled, water rushing over them, before the man was hauled to safety. He collapsed, gasping, fingertips blue with cold. Far below, inside the hull where no human dared go now, the sea thundered through the compartments with unstoppable force. It filled rooms once warm with lamplight. It crushed walls. It swept through hallways where laughter had once echoed only a day before. The Arctic's interior had become an underwater labyrinth, a place of echoes and dark currents. The ship shuddered with every new collapse. On the tilted deck, a small boy, barely 5, stood alone, clutching a woolen scarf. His voice was thin, shaking. "Mama. Papa." No one answered. A woman hurried toward him, lifting him into her arms. She pressed his head against her shoulder, whispering soft assurances she didn't believe herself. The boy's tiny fingers twisted into her coat, holding on with desperate strength. Another deep crack tremored through the ship, louder than before. It rolled through the metal like thunder trapped underwater. A scream tore through the crowd. "She's breaking apart." Luce raised his voice, not with the authority of a captain now, but with the urgency of a man fighting to preserve whatever humanity he could in the final moments. "Hold on to the rails. Stay together." But the wind swallowed him. The deck beneath his feet tilted further, forcing everyone to scramble upward toward the stern, the last part of the ship still above the waves. Some slipped. Some crawled. Some had to be helped to their feet by strangers whose names they never knew. The stern rose higher, lifting them above the water like the final breath of a drowning swimmer. For a moment, the ship seemed to hover in its agony, straining to keep the survivors just one moment longer from the cold that waited below. The bow disappeared entirely. A long, mournful sound reverberated through the night, steel bending under a weight it was never meant to bear. The Arctic trembled, almost violently, as if shaking against the inevitability of her end. Captain Luce forced himself to look. He needed to bear witness. To hold the final image in his memory so that none aboard would be forgotten. The Atlantic surged a step closer. The ship's final battle had begun. The stern of the Arctic rose higher into the air, tilting the world into a near-vertical nightmare. Passengers clung to whatever they could, railings, vents, protruding pipes, anything that kept them from sliding toward the icy maw below. Every movement required strength they no longer had, their limbs were numb, their breaths thin and ragged. The cold had become a living presence among them, whispering surrender into their bones. A man near the upper deck lost his grip. His boots slipped on the wet planks, arms flailing as he slid downward. A sailor reached for him, caught his sleeve, held on for a heartbeat. But the angle was too steep. The fabric tore. The man's scream vanished into the roar of wind and water as he dropped into the churning blackness below. The sailor bowed his head, shoulders shaking, though no tears came. The cold had stolen even those. Captain Luce forced himself upward along the slanted deck, grabbing a metal handrail slick with frost. The wood groaned underfoot. The ship trembled again. Below him, the Atlantic surged over the bow, swallowing windows, swallowing corridors, swallowing memories. The vessel that had carried thousands safely across the ocean now sank under the hands of the very water she once conquered. Up here, a voice shouted from the stern. Stay together. A group gathered near the mizzen-mast, the last vertical structure still fully above water. Families huddled, pressing close for warmth. Strangers held each other without hesitation. An elderly woman clasped the hand of a young sailor, whispering words of comfort that were meant more for herself than him. His lips trembled, but he nodded, letting her pretend that they shared strength neither truly had. Somewhere behind them, a faint melody drifted through the chaos, the soft hum of someone singing. It was barely audible, carried on the wind like a ghost of a lullaby. A woman rocked a child in her arms, humming through chattering teeth. The child's eyes were half closed, his face pale, but he clung to her coat with fragile determination. Luce watched her for a moment, feeling his chest tighten. In another world, another night, she might have been singing him to sleep. In this world, she was singing to stave off death. A sudden explosion of sound roared from below, a massive bulkhead buckling under enormous pressure. The ship jerked violently, sending several people sliding. Screams pierced the darkness. A man lunged for his wife, caught her hand just as she began to fall, and pulled her against his chest. They clung to each other with the raw instinct of survival, trembling as the ship settled a few inches deeper. The stern was almost vertical now. Those closest to the rail could see the water swirling beneath them, cloaked in foam, spinning with debris, pieces of wood, luggage, the remnants of broken lifeboats, evidence of the ship's struggle scattered like fragments of memory. Captain Luce steadied himself, pulling his coat tighter as the wind howled past. His mind ran through the faces he had seen tonight, children lifted into boats, women torn from their husbands, sailors lost in the dark water. He wondered how many had survived. How many would drift into the stormy morning? How many would never be found when the sea calmed? A sailor crawled toward him along the rail, panting. "Captain, we should jump. If we stay, she'll pull us under." Luce's eyes drifted toward the water. The surface boiled and frothed around the ship as she sank. But jumping into that freezing chaos felt like stepping into death itself. "Help who you can," he murmured instead, voice thick. "Hold on as long as possible." The sailor hesitated, then nodded, moving to assist a shivering group clinging to the mast. A young woman caught Luce's arm. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady in a way that startled him. "Please, please tell me someone will come." He wanted to lie. To offer a spark of mercy. But he could not. His lips parted, and no words came at all. Another shudder, this one deeper, final sounding, rippled through the Arctic. Wood splintered. Metal screamed. The stern lifted sharply, forcing everyone into a last desperate climb upward. The ship was reaching her breaking point. From somewhere below, a haunting silence bloomed, an absence of sound so sudden and complete that it stole the breath from every throat. It was the moment before collapse, the moment the ocean pauses before claiming what is already hers. The next sound was the beginning of the end. A deafening, cavernous wrench tore through the night. The Arctic spine was giving way. The wrenching sound tore through the Atlantic night like the world itself had split open. It was not a single crack, but a chain of violent ruptures, metal twisting, beams snapping, iron ribs shearing apart under the unbearable strain. The Arctic stern lurched skyward another impossible degree, forcing passengers into a final, scrambling ascent. They clawed at anything solid, bolts, railings, seams in the wood, nails breaking, hands bleeding, voices hoarse from screaming. For a moment, the ship hung there. Suspended. A massive silhouette rising against a void of fog and darkness, her proud lines distorted into the shape of a creature dying in agony. Then came the roar. Not from the ship, but from the sea. A towering wave smashed across the remaining deck, sweeping several passengers away so violently that their cries vanished before they hit the water. A woman lost hold of her husband's coat and slid down the pitching deck, grasping for him as the wave lifted her effortlessly over the side. Her scream cut through the night, echoing long after the ocean swallowed her. A boy clung to a vent, knuckles white, feet dangling toward the swirling abyss. A stranger reached out, a man he had never met, grabbing the boy's collar and hauling him to a safer grip. "Don't let go," the man shouted, voice cracking. "Don't let go." The boy nodded through tears, but his lips were too numb to form words. Captain Luce braced himself against the mast, breath coming in sharp bursts. He felt the ship's final vibrations beneath his boots, the deep, trembling pulse of a vessel that had fought too long, too hard. The Arctic had been strong, faster than most, beloved by the passengers who had walked her decks. But no ship could withstand this, the bow torn open, the hull gutted, the ocean pouring through her like blood through a wound. She had minutes. Maybe fewer. The stern tilted again, sending a rain of debris downward. A grate broke loose, skidding toward the sea. A man leapt over it just in time, though he lost his footing and slid several feet, stopping only because another sailor caught the back of his coat. Their eyes met, strangers bound together by terror and the fragile thread of instinctive humanity. A woman near the rail clutched her daughter tightly, whispering into her hair, "Don't look. Don't look at the water," but the girl did. Her small face twisted in fear as she watched the ocean devour the forward half of the ship. Then, without warning, the final lantern on deck went out. Darkness swallowed everything. The screams became disembodied. The ship became nothing more than sound and motion, the groaning of steel, the cry of wind, the relentless rush of the sea. "Jump," someone yelled. "Jump now before she pulls us under." Others echoed the plea, but many hesitated. The cold would kill them. The waves would drag them down. The lifeboats were far, too far for most to reach. And still, the ship remained a higher ground, a slanting island of wood and iron clinging to the last breath of the world above. Another deafening crack split the night. The Arctic's stern shivered. Then dropped. Not slowly. Not gradually. But in one sickening, catastrophic motion. Passengers screamed as they lost their grip. Bodies slid downward, some tumbling, others trying desperately to crawl upward against gravity. Captain Luce dug his fingers into the railing, but the force of the drop wrenched him from it. He stumbled, catching himself against a vent, gasping as cold air rushed past his face. The stern hung there, almost vertical, water surging up its length. People jumped. Some willingly. Some because the ship threw them. The first bodies hit the water with hollow splashes, followed by choking gasps, desperate cries, frantic thrashing. The cold hit them like a weapon, sharp, paralyzing, immediate. Some resurfaced only for a second. Others never did. Luce hesitated at the edge, chest heaving. His eyes swept over the chaos, the scattered survivors, the empty sea, the stern rising above him like a monument to everything he had failed to protect. He whispered something only the wind could hear. Then the Arctic gave one final, thunderous groan, a long, sorrowful exhale. The stern lifted. Paused. And plunged. Captain Luce jumped. The ocean swallowed the ship in a violent whirl of foam, wood, and darkness. A massive vortex pulled downward, dragging wreckage and bodies into the deep. Screams echoed, muffled beneath the thunder of waves. Then. Silence. The Arctic was gone. All that remained were fragments, floating timbers, overturned lifeboats, survivors clinging to anything that still floated. And the echo of a tragedy that would ripple far beyond the cold, endless Atlantic night.